And so South Bend being a city, in the north here, it's a mid-sized sort of industrial city. There were quite a few opportunities, job opportunities, and a lot of African-American families, again, looking for a better life, facing sort of that Jim Crow segregation and fewer opportunities in the South, made their way north here. Like you said, starting in the early 20th century, and kind of saw this happening in two waves, right? So we see really from about the 1910s up into the 1930s, and then you see kind of that second wave after World War II, when you see an even larger influx of African Americans, primarily men, coming here, and their families would join them oftentimes after World War II, and settling in cities like South Bend and Chicago, Detroit, where these larger industrial centers were. So Studebaker was the largest employer here in South Bend for many years, and they were known to hire African Americans. Yeah, so they were primarily African American men would come and were looking for these jobs in factories like Studebaker. They were known to pay fairly well. It was a good living wage. But that being said, they often were still relegated to these more dangerous jobs, in different departments. So at Studebaker, the foundry was one area that African American men found themselves working in. I mean, it was hard work, a lot of heavy lifting, very hot. So there was still some of that segregation in hiring, depending on where you're working. There were some African American women that also worked as secretaries and whatnot. But Studebaker again did hire African Americans both before and even more so after World War II, when you saw a larger influx of African Americans coming to South Bend. You didn't see a lot of mobility within jobs. I mean, so a lot of sometimes you'd see, an individual maybe become like a team leader, a crew leader or something, but there weren't a lot of African Americans in leadership positions. In Studebaker, for example, that just wasn't common at all, really, through the 50s into the 1960s. Still very much a sort of Caucasian-dominated industry. Now, that being said, if we go back, right, early on, when their numbers were smaller, there was a lot more sort of, I guess, mingling, if you will, because there were a lot of first-generation immigrants here from countries like Poland and Hungary, and so it was really kind of as that population grew that you see more of that, sort of segregation take place. But there were still respected workers in the factory. They weren't, facing a lot of that overt sort of racism and discrimination in the actual work, right? But outside, I mean, it was still a very segregated city, right? So African Americans were, living in their own neighborhoods and still faced a lot of the, same problems they would have faced in other cities, right, with housing and again, access to certain other things we take for granted. The immediate aftermath after the plant closed here in late 1963, I mean, a lot of people were out of jobs, right? And a lot of those people did find new jobs, I think, in the following months and years. I mean, there were new industries that came into town, but still, I mean, you're sort of seeing the sort of slow decline of a so-called Rust Belt city. And so, yes, a lot of those industries didn't come back. There still were opportunities, but, keep in mind that African Americans were still facing a lot of the same discrimination they were. And so you see a lot of sort of disenfranchisement still happening, even all the way up through today. And so I think it's at a time when a lot of other industries weren't hiring African Americans at all, right? And there was that sort of like line. I think that legacy is great, but we're still facing a lot of the sort of problems that came out of that era today. So.
Big news, Studebaker. Craftsmanship with a flair. The standout car in the low price field, the only car in the low price field that's really, really new. Studebaker, big news, Studebaker.